In 1945, Labour won one of their largest majorities in a general election, which led to Clement Attlee running the country up until 1951. The Labour Manifesto, Let Us Face the Future, had offered change, an idea that was shared by the majority of the nation. Despite the war being fresh in the memory of the people, which the Tories hoped would win them the election, so was the economic depression of the 1930s, which the general public was so keen to avoid after sinking back into after the war had been won. So the public wanted change, and that's what the Labour Manifesto promised. In this presentation, I'm going to first discuss the main points of the manifesto, then say how it appealed to voters and how it painted the opposition party, and whether it was just a manifesto that won Labour the election, or if other factors concerning the other parties helped as well. Obviously 10 minutes is too short to relay the entire manifesto and analyse it, so I'm just going to present what I think are some of the most important points of the manifesto and focus on these and analyse how these policies could attract the vote from the public. Possibly the biggest change to Labour's 1945 manifesto was the changes to Clause 4. This stipulated Labour's plan for the economy, namely nationalisation of failing industries and supervision of industries that are still in business. The idea of this public ownership and supervision scheme was to try and maintain the standards of living and to keep unemployment to a minimum. Obviously, with the unemployment with 1930s still fresh in people's mind, and a number of soldiers coming back from the war triumphant, looking to get back into the normal world of work, the idea of controlling the economy to ensure high employment was very attractive to many of the voters. Another point the manifesto made was regarding the housing and buildings programmes. This stipulated the need for a balanced programme of building housing and schools and modernising factories. It also introduced price controls for housing and pledged to build enough housing for all, and the idea of a ministry for housing and planning. In Kevin Jeffreys' The Labour Party since 1945, he states that this was a deliberate attempt to win the favour of the working class families. With the Blitz as well, this was mainly more important to people in the major population centres than those in the countryside. But even those who were in the countryside and had been affected by evacuation and still stray bombs recognised the need to house people in the country and rebuild all the centres that were lost. One of the other plans presented in the manifesto was the idea of jobs for all. They wanted to avoid receding back into the troubles of the 1930s economic depression. To do this, they proposed full employment, a maintenance of good wages, social services, insurance, and less taxation for those less well off. Also, a national investment board was to be introduced to determine the social priorities, and also bringing the Bank of England under public ownership. Again, this ties in with the point of the nationalisation scheme in Clause 4, that people still remembered what it was like with severe employment deficits and would be keen to avoid it again. The introduction of a National Health Service was also one of Labour's big points in Let Us Face the Future. The idea of better housing and better feeding was part of ensuring the health of the nation and its children, but the implementation of the National Health Service was half of the plan. It specially mentioned looking after mothers and the children of the country, and also ensuring proper conditions for doctors and nurses. This was a hit with the people, as it meant they would save money on basic medical care in exchange for a small monthly fee, and meant that you could be treated at any point. It was also helpful in winning over the votes of the doctors, who at first were sceptical of the National Health Service, as they believed their wages would be cut, but the promise of keeping wages and conditions at a decent level for doctors and nurses helped swing their vote over. Another key plan was bringing in the welfare state, or social insurance as they called it. They wanted people to have provisions for when things went bad, and economic controls to try and ensure that things didn't get too drastically bad. Even in the manifesto, they admitted that keeping these up will be expensive, as has proven over the last 50 plus years, yet they committed themselves to extending social insurance to all people, not just a certain class of people. This was popular as it took the essence of the Beveridge Report, which in itself was popular, and adapted it into a policy and to try and look after the people at the lower end of the economic spectrum. Andrew Thorpe said in his book, A History of the British Labour, that a distrust of the Tories' record on social reform was important in gaining the majority of the working class vote with this idea. Another thing that helped the Labour grab the electorate was that they didn't attack any certain class. Although traditionally a working class party, they came out and said they were not against a higher class or the upper class, but they were against a functionless class and believed that it was only the people who weren't contributing to society that needed to change, not wealthy people who still contributed. They also attacked the Tories somewhat in their manifesto, claiming that Labour led the fight against the mean and shabby treatment which was the lot of millions, while Conservative governments were in power over long years, referring mainly to the 1930 economic depression. It also clamoured for Liberals to support them, saying it was a fight between the Tories and Labour was the only one who would bring the country forward, whilst the Tories would take them back to the 1930s. Kenneth O'Morgan, in the UK political parties since 1945, says that the manifesto was so popular as it set out with clarity what they intended to do, as opposed to the Conservatives' manifesto. However, it wasn't just a manifesto that won it for Labour. The Tories felt that the fact that they had won the war with their Prime Minister in charge would ensure them victory, and focused solely on promoting Churchill and his image. They didn't offer any updated policies, even with the country clamouring for change, and Churchill himself made a couple of gaffes along the way, saying Labour would need some form of Gestapo to keep their new society in order if they got into power. After they had served together for 5 years in the war coalition, this almost seemed like backstabbing from Churchill and didn't endear him to voters. Also, a lot of Liberal voters recognised, as claimed in the manifesto, Labour's manifesto, that this would be a fight between Labour and the Tories, and through their lotting with Labour as they were more ideologically aligned with the Liberals than Liberals and Tories ever were. However, the modernised manifesto has many points which the public agreed with, and it would be wrong to say that it was not effective, but there were other factors which enabled Labour to win. The combination of these is hard to pick apart, as if the manifesto wasn't good enough and appealing to the public, they likely wouldn't have won. But if the Tories had updated theirs as well, they still might not have won with their manifesto. The manifesto was crucial, but not the sole reason for victory in my opinion. However, you cannot deny that the change it promised did win them the election in some way. Thanks very much. I've been Stephen Wood. Thanks for listening.